Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Kirsten Swartz, Manager of Education and Community Engagement Programs at Brattleboro Museum and Art Center. It's my pleasure to be your host for tonight's presentation by Scott Boyd and Tim Brookes on the Endangered Alphabets Project. This program will be, in this program, we will present a talk by Scott Boyd and Tim Brookes, followed by a Q&A session with all of you. Admission for this program is pay as you wish, and if you would like to donate to the Brattleboro Museum and Art Center to support this and future arts programs, you can do so at the link in the chat. Or at brattleboromuseum.org/support. You'll also find information about our membership program on that page as well. This event is presented in connection with Scott Boyd's exhibit, The Endangered Alphabets Project, which opened at the Brattleboro Museum in May and is on view through November. The Endangered Alphabets Obelisk is located in the sculpture garden just outside the museum. It has 4 sides, each with inscriptions of hello and goodbye in different endangered alphabets from cultures across the globe. Scott's inspiration for this sculpture came in part from his encounters with Tim Brookes' Endangered Alphabets Project, which seeks to preserve and raise awareness around endangered languages. Scott and Tim are here tonight. Scott to share a bit about his process and the development of his Endangered Alphabets sculpture, and Tim to speak to the Endangered Alphabets Project more broadly. So in just a moment, I'm going to ask Scott and Tim to join me on screen. The plan is that they will speak for about 50 minutes or so, and then we'll open up for your questions and comments. To submit a question or comment, if you're here via Zoom, please use the Q&A button on your screen. You can do that at any time, and we'll get to them at the end of the talk. If you're watching on Facebook Live, you can type your questions or comments there, and we'll keep an eye on that too. So I can see Scott and Tim have turned their cameras on. Welcome. I'll tell you a bit more about them before they start. Tim Brookes is the founder and executive director of the Endangered Alphabets Project. He has exhibited carvings of minority scripts and spoken on the deep relationship between writing, culture, and social justice at over 150 colleges, universities, libraries, museums, and galleries, including Harvard, Yale, Cambridge, the First Nations University in Canada, the Smithsonian, and the Library of Congress. He lives on the shores of Lake Champlain. More information about the Endangered Alphabets Project can be found at endangeredalphabets.com. Scott Boyd describes creating sculpture as being like exploring a new language, developing its vocabulary and seeking out the abstractions of thought that can best bring expression into the possibility of communication. His work has been exhibited in New York, New York, Boston, Mass, Portland, Oregon, New Haven, Connecticut, various locations in Vermont, Garrison, New York, and Paris, France. Previously in New York City for 20 years, Boyd now lives and works in Stowe, Vermont. He received his BA from Reed College and his MFA in sculpture from Yale University School of Art. You can find more about Scott and his sculptures at scottboydsculpture.com. Scott and Tim, thank you for being here tonight. It's great to see you. I'll turn it over to Tim now for a few introductory words.
Okay, so Kirsten, thank you so much for inviting us, and thanks for the introduction. And also thanks to the Brattleboro Museum and Art Center for being the host, not only to this talk, but also to Scott's obelisk sculpture. I decided that it would be much better for Scott to talk about his sculpture first, because one of the issues with endangered alphabets is that even though everybody's heard of endangered languages, most people are extremely unfamiliar either with a broad range of different scripts or writing systems, or with the very notion that writing systems or scripts or alphabets could become endangered or extinct. So the idea of being able to actually plant an obelisk in the sculpture garden so that this becomes visible front and center to everybody is a wonderful idea. I'm going to talk more about my work and the project later on, but I think best to turn you over now to Scott and invite Scott to tell you about the thinking process, the manufacturing process, the installation process, and all of the ingredients that went into making this installation. So Scott, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Tim, and thank you, Kirsten. I would like to talk about the process of making the sculpture, what I went through. Where does the creative impetus come from to initiate developing a new sculpture? How opportunity, influence, and serendipity inspire the creation of sculpture. So the idea for the obelisk began with a call to artists from the Helen Day Art Center in Stowe, Vermont, for large-scale outdoor sculpture incorporating the theme of text and symbol. For me, the challenge was to find a way to fuse text and symbol in such a way that combined, one would add meaning to the other. I needed to find answers to the questions, what is text and what is symbol? And further, how can I relate my art-making process to the dynamic that will bring text and symbol together? The hunt was on. Unbeknownst to me, my process of designing the sculpture had already begun several years earlier when I attended a talk given by Tim Brookes on endangered alphabets at the River Arts Gallery in Morrisville, Vermont. There on the walls were Brookes's exquisitely hand-carved examples of these alphabets. I learned many things about the roughly, I believe, 2,000 written languages that will likely disappear this century. I was moved by their wildly different ingenuities, calligraphic styles, quirky strokes and rhythms, each one having its own hope and history to communicate. These alphabets reminded me of the overlapping languages I was exposed to when my family lived in Leopoldville, now Kinshasa, capital of the Congo in Africa, back in the 1960s. There I had made friends with 3 Congolese boys who each spoke several languages, including French and Lingala, the Congo River trade language, as well as 2 or 3 of the local and overlapping dialects of the region. Lingala, the most common native tongue, stemmed from Bobangi, a Bantu language that had many borrowings from various other languages such as Swahili, Kikongo, French, Portuguese, and English. Hello, by the way, in Lingala is Mbote. Goodbye is Tikala Malamu. With my new friends, I explored the surrounding villages, experiencing firsthand the ebb, flow, and clash of languages competing for relevance. So, for the theme of text and symbol, endangered alphabets came to mind as the natural textual premise that would ultimately coalesce around the form of the sculpture. Next, I needed a 3-dimensional symbolic context, one that could become a beacon, a Rosetta Stone, an exclamation point to the short distance between life and death for an endangered alphabet. Now, rather than be looking for an answer, I wanted the sculpture to become a question. Signs are symbolic. They are vehicles of communication. They guide us looking forward, and they guide us looking back. They inform us of where we are going in the present moment. I needed a proverbial road sign to give credence to the endangered alphabet's precarious perch in time and space. Ultimately, I settled on using an obelisk. Combining text with an obelisk can transmit many things: a public record, a story, a punctuation of time, a memorial to a person, witness to an historical event, or perhaps even a prophecy. The obelisk is at once a symbol of life and death, a long distance call to say hello and goodbye, a symbol to connect back and forth through the ages. Having never created an obelisk sculpture before, I started my adventure of figuring out how I was going to make it. I visited with Tim Brookes to learn from his own creative process. I began talking with and learning from craftspeople in tree logging, chainsaw carving, fine woodworking, sign making, sandblasting, welders and memorial makers. I consulted with other artists, graphic designers, and printers, as well as the Stowtown engineer. Everyone I talked to seemed keenly interested in the obelisk project. Now I began my search, not as a scholar, but as an artistic explorer for endangered alphabets representing as many continents as I could find, looking for a rainbow of characters to wrap around the four sides of the obelisk. Tifinagh, Nsibidi, Nubian, and Ngo from Africa. Nushu, the secret women's script from Hunan, China. The Native American Cherokee, Cree, and Inuktitut. Glagolitic, a writing system used in Bulgaria by the church. The Samaritan Alphabet, which comes from the Samaritan Hebrew, spoken by as few as 120 persons at one point, only last century, but now making a comeback. And many languages from Asia, such as Lana from Thailand and the Vietnamese Shuichu and Kalmyk from Bangladesh. I wanted to diversify, not just in origin, but in the different shapes of the alphabets, the weight and emphasis of strokes, horizontal writing, some starting from the right, some from the left, as well as words written vertically, some rigidly geometric while others lyrically flowing. Hoping to not overlap too much the various styles and flavors of each original writing system, yet finding the visual rhythm and balance that could bring them all together. The Endangered Alphabets samples for the computer graphics were found far and wide on the internet. I had hoped to inscribe the translation of hello, goodbye for each language, but it proved to be impossible to find for many of them. Therefore, some words are asemic, meaning words or parts of words that are abstractly composed with partial or unknown meaning. I meant well, however, in taking some artistic license and feel that my intention was and is there, represented in the artistic impact of each word inscribed. For the obelisk itself, rather than carve 30 different alphabets into an unwieldy 1,500-pound ash log, I decided to construct it using ash boards. The ash tree is traditionally sacred to the Abenaki people, native to Vermont and considered part of their folklore as the tree of life. Ironically, the ash tree itself is endangered due to the appetite of the emerald borer beetle. After some uncertainty about whether the exhibit would take place due to COVID, I got the go-ahead for the 2020 Expo show with only a month and a half to complete the Endangered Alphabets Obelisk sculpture from start to finish. The boards themselves had to be cut on a CNC router, a computer numerical control router. This is a computer-controlled cutting machine that can provide precisely angled cuts and miters into convex and curving surfaces. Once assembled around an 8-foot long 4-inch by 4-inch spine and polyurethane, it was ready for the letters. To cut the letters into the sides of the obelisk, I decided to go with sandblasting rather than chiseling them, as it could have taken months to hand chisel all the alphabets into a hardwood like ash. After the obelisk was sandblasted using adhesive rubberized stencils with the alphabets incised into them, I left the stencils on and used them to help paint the different colors and shadings of the letters. The obelisk was then coated with 4 coats of urethane. Miraculously, the sculpture was finished and successfully installed for the opening. I'm often asked what medium I work in. Rather than consistently work in the framework of one medium, I oftentimes allow the idea of the sculpture to ultimately determine what it is made of. This can lead to some interesting solutions that take me into new and unfamiliar territory. Some examples of my work include my Lobster Parabola sculpture. I came up with the idea of creating a piece that incorporated the form of a parabola. Living on Cape Cod at the time, I had a brother who had a lobster license and consequently had access to a lot of lobster shells. I started incorporating the leftover shells into sculptures and developed the parabola as a bell curve of time with an apex of confrontation. Enclosed in a rib cage of lobster shells, 2 toy soldiers square off against each other. The parabola itself is a graceful form that belies the conflict it contains. Portrait of a Barn is an example of a sculpture that I had to develop a new approach for in an outdoor sculpture show in Garrison, New York, which was sited in part in the fields of a farm. The organizers of the exhibition required that before accepting any artist's proposal, the artist had to visit the farm in order to encourage work that responds to and takes full advantage of its unique setting and withstand the attentions of a roving herd of 40 Black Angus cattle. I came up with a series of 3 white painted wooden modules lined up on a steep hillside opposite the farm's barn. These modules abstractly emulate the mass and shape of the farm's barn. Think board game Monopoly houses. Beyond the 3 forms, from the uphill side of the group, you can see that from a particular angle of view, they line up perfectly with the actual large white barn on the property on the hill opposite. I accommodated the shift in scale by sizing the modular barns to visually match the apparent size of the real one. I used the farm's existing barn as a waypoint in form and perspective to explore ways of relating art to architecture. Getting back to the Endangered Alphabets Obelisk. As human beings, we have a natural need and desire to communicate, which expresses and reminds us of who we really are. We are living in a time of cultural chauvinism, a time when the psychopathies of extinction are catching up with us on all fronts. It's important that we carry forward and keep alive the creative wisdom of different cultures and peoples, including our own, no matter how large or small in numbers they may be. And I'd like to close with a quote from Mary Schneider Enriquez at a talk she gave at the Harvard Art Museum. Quote, "How do we remember dated writing? the way art can speak from those that will never be with us again. And how can they be remembered? Art gives us a chance to remember to think and hold on to what life is, to say hello to those who are with us, and if not careful, goodbye to those who may no longer be heard or remembered. End of quote. So that's my talk for the evening. Before I pass it back to Tim, I'd like to take a moment to thank Kirsten Swartz, our moderator, for pulling the Zoom talk together. Mara Williams, Brattleboro Museum's chief curator, for her truly enthusiastic support in bringing the obelisk to the museum. Sarah Freeman, exhibition manager, for her organizational prowess. And Ananda Forrest, building manager, for his excellence in making the physical installation of the sculpture possible. Finally, thanks to Tim Brookes for the inspiration and hope of his work, as well as his power of example that's given many of these endangered alphabets a greater chance of being recognized and appreciated. So back to you, Tim.
Well, thanks. And thanks for that detailed and thoughtful explanation. So what I'm going to do is what everybody in the world is doing right now, which is to awkwardly pause and share my screen and start up a PowerPoint presentation so that we can actually see some of the things I'm talking about. Okay, so let me talk about how the Endangered Alphabets Project started, which is sort of similar to Scott's project, but on a much smaller scale and with much less skill and credentials. So I began the Endangered Alphabets Project as a carving project, even though I had no background whatsoever in linguistics or anthropology or woodwork or visual art for that matter. It was a great example of the fact that you never know what you can do until you stumble into it and land on your face. So this whole thing began 2009, 2010, when I had just started carving in wood. And really all the carving I had done was sort of signs, shingles for family members. And I discovered very much by accident that of the world's writing systems or scripts, of which there are perhaps 200 in use right now, fully 85% of them are not guaranteed to survive. The number that are really safe, which of course includes things like the Latin alphabet that we use, Cyrillic, Chinese, Japanese, Arabic, etc., is remarkably small. It's perhaps between 20 and 25. So I assumed that this was an area that had been sort of well mapped and written about and researched, and discovered to my astonishment that, as I said at the beginning of this, this program, even though everybody has heard of endangered languages, the field of endangered alphabets was entirely unexplored. And so what I did was, working from the website omniglot.com, which is kind of like an online encyclopedia of the world's writing systems. The example they gave at the foot of the page that shows this, each script in use, in many cases was Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations, written in 1947, I believe. And this article is extremely high-minded. It says all peoples were created alike in dignity and respect. They were endowed with reason and conscience and should act toward one another in a spirit of brotherhood. And I thought this was sort of very bitterly ironic, because many of these scripts that were exemplified in Omniglot were endangered precisely because people don't always behave towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. And so I thought what I would do would be to carve a few of these in wood, in Vermont maple, in fact, and exhibit them as a way of drawing attention to this issue. I had never done any carving or art project remotely as demanding as this. Essentially, I was teaching myself carving as I was going. You can see the tools that I was using. And this is a work in progress, one of the earliest, in fact, I think the very first that I worked on. This is actually Inuktitut, which is, or it's actually the Canadian Aboriginal syllabics, which was a script that was invented for writing First Nations languages, especially Cree and Ojibwe, and subsequently Inuktitut, which is the Inuit language. And so you can see in this photograph that there I am sort of fighting my way through this, having used carbon paper of all things. Who knew that there even was still carbon paper to transfer the image onto the wood? So the finished results tended to turn out looking something like this. So this is, again, Article 1. And this is in a script from the Philippines, which actually predated the arrival of the Spanish in the 16th century. And this was really one of the first scripts that got me thinking. Up until this point, it was strictly a carving project. But at this point, I started thinking, why are these letters so thin? I had to use my thinnest gouge. It was extremely difficult. This one carving took me probably 6 or 7 weeks. And then the painting, I hadn't yet realized, this is what an amateur I was. I hadn't yet realized that if you paint the groove that you've carved, and the paint kind of laps over the edge, you can just sand it off. I was so little of a woodworker, that hadn't occurred to me. So there I was, very, very, very delicately trying to paint all this, but it started me thinking, why is it so thin? And so that was the point where I started doing research into these scripts. So it turns out that this script, which is called Baybayin, and is one of maybe half a dozen traditional scripts from the Philippines. The reason it's so thin is because it was incised with the point of a knife in a tube of bamboo. And if you think about it, the outer skin of bamboo is actually quite hard. And so you've got a very sharp knife. And so what you're going to do is pretty much use just the point of the knife. And so not surprisingly, the letters are going to wind up being extremely thin. In fact, what they used to do traditionally was to scoop up a handful of ash from the fire and rub it into the letters so they would stand out more. And this is when I started realizing that each culture's script, especially these minority culture scripts, really were affected profoundly by the circumstances of that culture. The fact that, for example, in the Philippines, they were using bamboo, whereas just to the south, in Indonesia, they were using palm leaves. And in fact, this script may have arrived in palm leaf form and then was adapted to bamboo. And in the process, the letter shapes changed, because instead of writing with a stylus and producing these curving, fairly broad strokes on a palm leaf, you get these really, really narrow, really thin knife cuts. And so what that really means is that this script has the influence not only of the trading that took place between the islands in the Philippines and those further south in what is now Indonesia. So there is a historical and cultural effect playing out in the shapes of the letters. But also it means that the vegetation and the climate are all playing a part. And this was when I first started realizing that even if writing arrived in one particular area from one source. So it's thought, for example, that merchants from Gujarat arrived in the islands that we now think of as being Indonesia, and their written documents became the models for some of the writing systems that evolved. Even if they came from the same source, they're like the finches that Darwin found in the Galapagos. Every island, they're developing differently because of local conditions, which means conversely that, and this is something that we in our culture have a great deal of difficulty understanding, the script is enormously important because it reflects the culture and the history of that particular people and their setting. We don't understand this because basically 2/3 to 3/4 of the countries in the world use the Latin alphabet either as their first official script or their second official script. And so for us, it doesn't stand for us. It basically is linguistic duct tape. It's writing, it's stuff that you use to communicate. But for a culture that has its own script, that script means something extraordinarily profound and important. In fact, there are cultures in the world where elements of their script are still used on flags, for example, or in tourist trinkets and whatnot, even though the people in that culture can no longer read and write that script. That's how deep the connection is. Everything began to change in the endangered alphabets in 2012 when I met Mong Nhu. So Mong is from the Chittagong Hill Tracts, which is an upland area in southern and southeastern Bangladesh, sort of bordering on Myanmar. And he is an ethnic Marma. So the Marma are one of a number of indigenous people in Bangladesh. And in the Chittagong Hill Tracts in particular, which is this sort of upland forested region, there are 12 or 13 separate indigenous groups, each with their own cultures, their own language, and in some cases, their own script. And Mong told me what it was like to grow up in a country which did not recognize and in fact had profound contempt for his people and their traditions. So when he was about 6 years old, he was going off to his first day of school. He was very excited. His mother was very excited. He walked 1.5 miles, 2 miles to school. He arrives there and the teacher speaks not in his language, but in Bangla, which is the official national language. And of course, Mong, who speaks not only Marma, but actually a couple of the other indigenous languages, even at the age of 6, does not speak Bangla. That's the language of the official central, more ruling population of Bangladesh. And so he doesn't understand what the teacher is saying. And so he's kind of looking around like, I don't know what's happening. And the teacher sees this and assumes that he's not paying attention because he is a bad student, calls him up to the front of the class and beats him with a cane. This happens twice on his first day of school. And he goes home, and the following morning, when he should be going up to school, he's just sitting there with tears running down his face. And his mother says, why aren't you going to school? And he tells her the whole story. And a pretty remarkable thing happened, which is that his mother essentially allowed him to stay home and homeschooled him. And you remember, you're talking about a village, rural community a long way from the nearest town with very, very few resources, no electricity, for example, at the time. And not only that, but it's an area which is militarized. It's sealed off by the military, and the army carries out periodic raids on villages and burns houses. So these are tough circumstances. He does well enough to earn a scholarship to a school some distance away. He does well enough there to be admitted to the University of Hawaii. And he speaks English well enough to be able to get a degree there. And at this point, when I met him, he was actually in the Graduate School of Education at Harvard. And the reason he was there was because he had just started, back in the Hill Tracts, a school in which Indigenous children would be taught in their own language, and as far as possible in their own scripts, because as I say, some of these languages had their own scripts. So when I heard this, I'm like, okay, I'm going to help you. This is the real thing. This was the time when the Endangered Alphabets Project went from being a carving project with a certain kind of distance from its subject. I was interested, I was curious, but I didn't really get it until I saw what it was like from the other side. And so at that point, I began collaborating with Mong and a nonprofit that he had started to produce educational materials in these Indigenous scripts. Because here's the point. The teachers are trying to teach these kids, but there are no teaching materials because the government refuses to provide any kind of educational materials in these traditional Indigenous languages, even though many of these languages are extremely ancient and have tens of thousands of speakers. So one of the first things I did was to carve Article 1 again in mahogany. And this is in the Chakma script and the Chakma language, which is one of the scripts of a very kind of settled and well-respected minority in Bangladesh and India, but especially in the Hill Tracts. But the fact is that the imposition of a one language, one script system by the government ever since the founding of Bangladesh in the early 1970s meant that the vast majority of Chakma can no longer read or write their own alphabet. In fact, I met a Chakma guy, highly educated, very sophisticated, working in Dhaka, the capital, whose father had been a writer in Chakma and had a collection of literature and works and all kinds of things in the Chakma script, which was destroyed when the army came in and burned down their house and killed his father. So it became really clear how fragile a minority script can be. So this was one of my first things, was to do these carvings that were sent out to the school. The second thing we did was to start creating alphabet charts that they could put up on the walls and fonts. This is another of the scripts from the Hill Tracts. It's called Mro. And this is an extraordinary picture because what you're seeing here is kids, most of these are Marma, I believe, in this school in the Hill Tracts, who are seeing their own writing for the first time. They have just received these books in their own script. And, you know, you would think young kids, you know, getting school books, not really a cause for celebration and joy. And yet, look at their faces. This is a huge moment. So we did a number of things to try and help them. This is actually a jigsaw puzzle we made in the Marma script. So this is a picture of a storm. This is the Marma word storm. We put it on jigsaw puzzle because when you're starting to learn a script, symbol recognition, what is this letter? How is it said? How is it different from other letters? How do I distinguish between them? Is really one of the most important early steps. So we did jigsaw puzzles. I created rubber stamps so the kids could stamp out their letters. We did writing journals and coloring books. And then perhaps the most groundbreaking thing we did was to create this 6-language dictionary. So one of the things about indigenous communities is that they often are not monolinguistic, right? They're pluralistic. There are different people, many of whom speak bits of each other's languages, and they coexist. The notion that each country has one language, or even that each area in a country has only one language, is really a myth perpetuated by national governments. And here, what we decided to do was on each page, we would have an illustration, and then we would have the word for that illustration in 6 languages. English, because that's the world language. Bangla, because that's the national language. And then Chakma and Tripura and Marma and Mro. And we deliberately put them in a circle so that there wouldn't be a sense that one was more important than the others because it's at the top. We think this is the first dictionary of its kind ever created in the world. We did it entirely on donations through a Kickstarter campaign. I'm going to tell you at some point later that the Endangered Alphabets Project exists almost entirely on donations. I shall tug at your heartstrings. This was the work that was done in conjunction with Hmong and a variety of other people for indigenous peoples of the hill tracts of Bangladesh. And it really kind of set it taught us a bunch of skills, and it set the tone for some of the other projects that the Endangered Alphabets would take on. So this, in a sense, is the descendant of that dictionary. This is an Abenaki dictionary. So of course, you know that the Abenaki are the ancestral people of Vermont and northern New Hampshire, parts of Maine, southern Quebec, parts of upstate New York. But again, there are virtually no teaching materials for Abenaki, even though every school in Vermont is required to teach about 2 Native American cultures. Virtually nobody teaches anything about the Abenaki. And there are a number of reasons for that, one of which is that there are no teaching materials. So I collaborated with the Abenaki tribe in Missisquoi up in Swanton. And we had a youth group, an after-school group of kids. And we went to them and said, what are the words that we should put in this dictionary? We're going to have this 100-word dictionary. What are the words that are important to an understanding of Abenaki culture and Abenaki life? And it became more than a dictionary because, as you can see from this front cover, which is the one on the right, this is actually part of the creation myth, the Abenaki creation myth. So this is actually the ancestral spirit that became Lake Champlain. And so it's not just a lake, it also is this kind of spiritual panorama as well. And then what we did was we then turned the intellectual property, the copyright, over to the Missisquoi band of the Abenaki, and that means that they have the files and the tools to go ahead and print more of these and to sell them to bring money into the tribe as they wish. Around the same time, I also did a series of carvings for the various tribal cultural centers around Vermont and upstate New York. This is one for the Nulhegan Cultural Center, and it says, "We are still here," because one of the issues that Indigenous people face all over the world is they're so marginalized, people don't even know that they're still there or that they exist at all. They are shoved not only away from the corridors of power and money, they're shoved so far into the shadows that it's not even that people don't care about them, it's that people don't even know they're there. So I'm going to move on to this project that we're working on right now, which is coming to a head as we speak. So this is actually, it's a tabletop game. This all came about because last summer, the Chinese government announced that in what they call the autonomous province of Inner Mongolia, which is part of the traditional Mongol lands of Central Asia, education, which had been not only in the Mongolian language, but in this fascinating and unique vertical Mongolian script, which you can see sort of in the middle at the top, that line that comes down with the letters sort of sprouting off it. That starting in the fall of 2020, children would learn in the Chinese alphabet and the Chinese language. And given what else is happening in China, it was really clear this is part of an effort to reduce the cultural autonomy and sense of tradition and independence of the Mongol people. And so all of a sudden, it was really, really clear that this was a great opportunity for the Endangered Alphabets Project because it demonstrates really clearly the connection between language and writing and culture. This is the script that is associated with the triumphs of Genghis Khan, who created the largest continuous land empire the world has ever known, with the glory of the Mongol people, with their history and their unique identity. And so to take that script away means more to them than we can imagine, because, as I say, we don't have our own unique script. So after much thinking and consultation with people in Mongolia and Russia, because there are Mongols in Russia, and Inner Mongolia in China, because, as I say, there are Mongols there, and a variety of other people around the world who knew more than I did about this, I decided we were going to make a game. So the purpose of the game is twofold. It's to introduce people in the West whose only notion of the Mongols is, bloodthirsty hordes of savages, such as you see in video games, which is a stereotype that is now 700 years old. And to introduce people in the West to the extraordinary richness and diversity of Mongol history, Mongol culture, Mongol language, the Mongol script, obviously, Mongol mythology, and also to provide a game that could be played in the Mongol lands as a way of keeping their own sense of their cultural heritage and value alive. And so in this game, it's sort of based on the Greek idea that the gods play out their drama on the human chessboard. So in this game, a variety of Mongol deities each have a different vision of what the Mongol people and the Mongol lands should become. So for one god, it's to maintain this tradition of nomadic movement and herding around the vast open lands of the steppes. For another, it's to convert this territory into a wildlife reserve with snow leopards and reindeer and wolves. And then for another god, their ulus, which is their vision of the land, is one of social justice. It's a place where no Mongol child goes hungry. And so the way that these gods sort of struggle for ascendancy, you know, whose vision is going to triumph, is that their human champions, all of whom are drawn from Mongolian history, their actual figures, or from Mongolian mythology. They travel around the Mongol lands fighting Mongol monsters from Mongol mythology to win assets and points. And then at the end, they all come together at this traditional festival that happens every summer in Mongolia called Nadam, which is like a cross between the Olympics and a state fair. And there are 3 traditional Mongol games: archery, horse riding, and wrestling, that are competed for. And there's storytelling and there's trading, etc. And all of those are in the game. And in the game, we even use this remarkable tool, which is a feature of children's games, but also divination throughout Asia, which is the shagai. So the shagai are sheep's knuckle bones that are used, that are rolled, and that each face is different and has a different name. And each face means a different outcome. And so the game comes with a bunch of shagai that get rolled to petition the gods for favors. So that's what we're doing right now. The game is just about ready. Again, it's funded entirely by a Kickstarter campaign last fall. We have our shagai, we have our cards, we have our score sheets, and the game, instead of a game board, we have a circular game mat that is being made in Mongolia out of felt, which is the traditional material that is used for Mongolian yurts, you know, their tents. And they're all handmade, they're all hand stitched, and they feature the Mongolian script in various ways on the game mat. So we're just waiting for customs permission and UPS to get those in, and then the game is going to be ready. So that oh, I forgot I had a slide of the shagai. So there's the 4 faces of the shagai that it used in the game. So that is the kind of thing that the Endangered Alphabets do. We are working with many other cultures in various different ways to promote their scripts, to help them get their scripts digitized, to provide materials in their scripts. And I'm sure you have many questions which you can ask me during the Q&A. And so, oh, there's the game mat. That is one particular version of the Mongol script, which is called the folded version, which is all kind of compacted. There are, again, it's a country which is extraordinarily rich in writing systems and the use of writing. So that is thank you in the traditional vertical Bichig script, which is now 700-800 years old. And it's in this beautiful calligraphy that's done with brush. And that says Bayalala, which is pronounced actually Bayala. It means thank you for listening. Thank you for your attention. Thank you to the Brattleboro Museum and Arts Center, who I'm sure can use your donations and support. If you have anything left over after you've supported them, you can support us by going to endangeredalphabets.com/ and there's a link to how to support us. As I say, we are dependent almost entirely on donations. And I'm going to stop this screen sharing right now. I'm going to get out of there and come back to the webinar and turn it back over to Kirsten, our moderator, who is going to be only too happy to take your questions and pass them on to Scott and to me.
Thank you so much, Tim, and thank you, Scott. That was really wonderful to hear from both of you about the sculpture, and Scott and Tim about your work with the Endangered Obelisks Project. We have a few questions coming in. As a reminder, you can use the Q&A function to ask your questions for our panelists here. And we'll start with one from Ellen. She says, Tim, do you consider cursive an endangered script, as in many cases it is no longer taught in public schools?
So not only is this the most common question that I get when I give talks, I'm not sure I've ever given a talk when somebody hasn't asked this question. And to get my answer to the question, if you go to our website, endangeredalphabets.com, and you click on the blog link and you scroll down a bit, you'll actually find an essay that I wrote about cursive and whether cursive is in fact an endangered alphabet. And my answer is actually quite long and complex. So I'm going to keep you in suspense. I'm going to send you to the source. And I'm going to pass us back over to Kirsten for the next question.
Okay, thank you. That's great. Leave us wanting more.
Yeah.
Ellen also asked Tim, for another one for Tim, if you reached out to the calligraphic community.
Yes. Not only have I reached out to the calligraphic community in this country, I am working directly with calligraphers in Mongolian, especially for our Ulas project, the tabletop game project. And one of them is right now actually working on what is going to be a kind of a special version of the game where each of the cards is going to feature the name of the monster or the god or the champion in Mongolian calligraphy. And I am a huge fan of calligraphy in general. And I am happy to hear from calligraphers all over the world because I don't have any training in calligraphy and I am learning from everyone all the time.
Great, thank you. And here we have a question for both of you from Christy Herbert. Tim and Scott, do you have plans to collaborate in the future on another project soon?
Scott, go ahead. Scott, I think you've muted yourself. You need to click on your microphone icon.
Is that better? Yeah, I haven't, Tim and I have not discussed that possibility. It's certainly always possible. I'm interested in developing more obelisks using different variations of the endangered alphabets. So Tim is always a great resource for information about the obelisk, the endangered alphabets. And so if it comes up and it's a possibility, I'd certainly be delighted to work with Tim on that.
Yes, I really envy Scott, his ability to work with scale and also his ability to find people who are prepared to then put his work in their sculpture garden. I've done a couple of large pieces, one of which was for the Smithsonian, but then they turned around and said, oh, sorry, we can't use this after all. So it's now taking up space. Yes, I think the notion of creating something that is like an obelisk or a memorial and which really has the ability to catch the eye is a commodity of extraordinary power and value. And if the possibility comes up, then I would certainly work with Scott again.
Great, thank you. I've been thinking about, as you were talking about the form of the obelisk, and I know, Scott, you talked a little bit about obelisks in your talk earlier, but I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on what the obelisk means and how it can be used as a communication tool.
Yeah, originally I did come up with the idea of using an obelisk, as you see them all over cemeteries. You're familiar with the Washington Monument, the Egyptian obelisk, of course. And so I was inspired by the hieroglyphics on some of the Egyptian obelisks. And the form of the obelisk, I was interested in sacred geometry as well, and seeing if I could possibly incorporate that into the design of the obelisk. But looking at the traditional shape of obelisk, it just seemed a little too heavy and grounded, too definite and somber, I think, even though the obelisk traditionally started with the Egyptian designers, and in their folklore, the obelisk was a sun ray reversed to the sky. And so they saw the obelisk as a connection between the earthly world and that of the spiritual world. And in fact, most of the obelisks used or developed in Egypt were made from red granite on their base and the stem of the obelisk, whereas at the top, the pyramid-shaped form, the pyramidium as it's called, was typically plated with gold. So it would reflect the sun and cast a beacon. And also added a spiritual component as far as attainment of knowledge and spiritual higher self. So I wanted to make an obelisk that was more alive in form. And so I decided to work in different taperings on the sides and give it a curve, whereas normally obelisks are straight. I wanted it to be, to be a question that the alphabets could be carved into and not be a dead end. And for that, it's the base of the obelisk is 10 inches by 10 inches. It gets tapered to 12 inches by 12 inches. And then at the top, it goes back to 10 inches by 10 inches. So, and also the four sides of the obelisk were cut with a CNC router so that they bulge outward slightly. So it gives it a sense of life. It gives the topic theme of endangered alphabets, I think, a questioning quality of where are these going, where are we going with our cultures, and I see the obelisk as a sign of strength and power, and I hope that imparts some of that meaning to the alphabets written on it.
Thank you. Thank you for expanding on that idea. We have another question for Scott. What does the crow or raven on the top of all four sides of the obelisk signify?
Yeah, the raven shows up in a number of many cultures, actually. It has a number of connotations and meanings. It's considered a messenger between the earthly and the spiritual worlds. It's known for its intelligence and speaking ability or cawing. It's very vocal. And for that reason, it's known as the ultimate oracle, if you will. It's also pointed to by numerous cultures as a keeper of powerful secrets. And in other cultures, for example, the Greeks, it was considered a solar animal. In for Native American legends, it was considered a hero. For the Inuit, for example, in their folklore, the raven tricked a giant sea monster into submission, and to this day, its body serves as the Alaskan mainland. Other Native American tribes saw the raven as the bringer of light. So there are a lot of different interpretations of the raven. Dr. Carl Jung, for example, deemed raven symbolism to represent the shadow self. So weighted down with that meaning, kind of suggestions, I thought that would be a good symbol to add to the top of the obelisk, to add gravity and question and mystery to it. And thank you for the question.
Kirsten, if I can just speak to a comment by Peggy Davis that got put in the chat. So Peggy wrote, I also developed lettering for some languages from Mexico and used Mayan writing as a resource. So I thought you might be interested to know that when I talk about the Endangered Alphabets Project, I'm really talking about two different kinds of script or writing system. One is a traditional script that has been marginalized and pushed aside, but the other is a new script that has been created by someone for their culture, so that their culture does have a unique form of writing that represents them, not only their language, but also represents them visually. And in fact, there is a guy in Ecuador who is creating a syllabary for Amazonian languages that, of course, traditionally, if they did have a writing system that was extinguished by the Spanish in the 16th century. So this guy has created this syllabary, which he's now introducing to a variety of different cultures in South America. And one of the things that I really like about it is that the letters actually look kind of Mayan. And as it happens, I am working on a carving right now in this script. So I'm going to turn my light to the side so you can see it. So this is a really nice piece of walnut. Each letter consists of a consonant and a vowel. So this is K, and this is Tsa, and this is Kwa, and this is Tul. So it's Quetzalcoatl, which is the plumed serpent god of mythology and religion in that area. So I've carved it in this lovely piece of walnut, and I'm actually going to be filling this with a gold flecked lapis, which I've never used before. So there are little bits of lapis coming to me in the mail at this point. So this is going to be a new departure, but I thought it'd be interesting to show that not only do we have people who are trying to revitalize their traditional scripts, but in a sense, people who are trying to undo the injustices of history in order to bring respect and recognition to their culture.
Great, thank you for calling our attention to that comment and for showing your carving there. This relates to another question I had, which is that both of you use the medium of carving and specifically carving into wood to express these alphabets. So I was wondering if you could speak to that. Why the carving and why wood for your initial urge for expressing these alphabets?
Scott, you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. As I mentioned in my talk, I kind of come up with the idea for a sculpture, and the idea determines the medium. And the obelisk was initiated through the call for text and symbol. And so I had decided to use an obelisk. I had just been interested in Tim Brookes's work and the Endangered Alphabet. So I do wood carving and I've done marble carving. So it was pretty familiar to me, the process. And I'd also done sandblasting as a quicker way of producing writing on wood or stone. So this carving into the wood, or the sandblasting into the wood using stencils, seemed like the natural solution. I hope that answers your question.
In my case, actually, it came about because I had just finished writing a book about the history of the guitar in America. And as part of the book, I was also writing about a master guitar maker who was making me a guitar. And so it was about the process of guitar making. And I've always loved wood, and this, watching him work with these just beautiful, beautiful woods had left me really wanting to do something with wood. And so when I first started thinking about these signs I was making for family members, which were actually Christmas presents, it was really just an excuse to go to the wood shop. And many of the first carvings I did were actually just offcuts that were in the bin that were being thrown away or on sale for like $1 a piece or whatever, which is pretty important when you're starting out, is to be able to experiment cheaply. When I did my first exhibition, I was really flattered that some of the master stone carvers from Barry came up to see it, and they cornered me, 3 of them. And they said, okay, this is great, but why aren't you working in stone? And I said, so there are 14 carvings here. I brought them here in a trunk that I had to drag from my car to get it here to put these up. If I did this in stone, I would have died in the process. Yes, I love the generosity of wood and its ability to absorb mistakes. I love the beauty of its grain and its form and its ripple and its other qualities, and it's portable.
Great. So it's a accessible medium for both of you. Yeah. That's great. I was wondering, Scott, if you could expand on how you selected the languages for the obelisk.
Yeah, it was complicated by the initial idea of finding examples of endangered alphabets that could be translated into hello, goodbye. And I was aware of endangered alphabets. I had been looking at Tim's website. I had looked at omniglot.com, which gives a lot of information about languages in general from all over the world, but includes some of these endangered alphabets. And I was looking for, I became frustrated because it was not entirely possible to find the translations. So I found part of the words. I had to trim them because they wouldn't have fit otherwise. So I took some artistic license there, I have to say and confess. But on the other hand, I was looking to create a work of art that had visual impact, and I wanted to display a wide variety of different styles and energies of these languages and alphabets from as many different parts of the world as I could find, to bring them all together into this one obelisk sculpture. So, you know, I had a large list of endangered alphabets to work from, and it just was a matter of pretty much piecing them all together to come out with the best design and impact as I could. That's my process pretty much.
Thank you. That's great. And Tim, a question for you. You have a lot of different educational materials that you've mentioned in your talk, the books and the game. And I was wondering, how do you decide what educational tools to make and how to best convey these languages, or how to shape these educational offerings?
So in some cases, these are just ideas that I have. In some cases, these are ideas that come from the community. So for example, with the Bangladesh project, we were very much looking to the teachers in the schools to say, you know, can you do something like this? Or how can you address this particular problem? So for example, art. There are many areas in the world where art is never taught as a school subject. And so we decided that we would create coloring books, but we would create coloring books that reflected the world that the kids knew. So we collected a bunch of photographs that were shot around the hill tracks, you know, in the villages, in the jungle, whatever. And we ran them through a software which essentially turns them into an outline that you can then color in. And so we printed a coloring book based on that, or a series of coloring sheets initially, I think. And we had to send colored pencils and crayons with them because they didn't have them. Those were just materials they didn't have. And those were immensely popular. And then the other thing that was even more popular, kind of surprised us, was actually an idea of my students. I was teaching at Champlain College at the time, and the students had the idea of creating a book which essentially had one of these colorable outline type pictures, and then just a lot of lines underneath. And the idea was that the kids in the hill tracks would color the picture in, and then they would write what they thought was happening in the picture. And again, this was really unusual because, again, in much of the developing world, education is not child-centric. It doesn't come from what the kids want to do. And so being asked what is their interpretation, what they think, was like an opportunity to get them more engaged in the act of writing. And they became immensely popular. The kids would do these and they would take them home and show them to their parents. They would get bound, you know, so that each kid would have a bound version of all of the Color My Story sheets they had done. So those were a couple of the things that we did. And those were just sort of very much in consultation with people from the area, and Mong himself, who was from the area, and the teacher in the schools.
That's great. Thank you. It's exciting to hear about your students' input and into the process and thinking about student-centered learning. So I think those are all the questions that we have from our participants. Are there any last words from our panelists before we wind down for the day?
Yeah, I'd
Just
like
say
to
thank you, really.
I'd like to say thank you also. I want to just relate one of the most rewarding aspects of having made this obelisk sculpture is having it displayed in public in a outdoor setting so that people can move around it and can view it at their leisure or if they're visiting. I've had a number of occasions where I've been with the obelisk and photographing or something, and viewers have come up and said hello, and many, quite a few of them recognize some of the writing on the obelisk, like the Tifinagh from the Berbers in North Africa, or the Lana from Thailand, and quite a few others that, imagine yourself a traveler or visitor from another country, and you come to Brattleboro, Vermont, and you encounter inscribed on the side of a 11-foot high wooden obelisk the writing from your own culture or that you're familiar with, that maybe it's not the dominant language anymore in your country, but you've seen it in signs and books and so forth. So just, I think for any artist, it's very satisfying to have your artwork appreciated and identified with, and know that I've, made a small a difference in that person's life. So, and again, I want to thank the Brattleboro Museum and Art Center for making that all possible. And I want to thank Tim also for his great talk tonight.
Thank you both. It was really wonderful to hear more about your work and about the Endangered Alphabets Project. So I think we're going to wrap up there. But before we sign off, I want to let everyone know that a recording of tonight's event will be available on our website in the next day or two on brattleboromuseum.org. And while you're there, you can check out the recordings of other events that we've presented online over the past year, and you can find those under the Events and Video Archive. And if you're in the Brattleboro area, I encourage you to come to the museum for an in-person art experience. We're open Wednesday through Sunday, 10 to 4, and admission is on a pay-as-you-wish basis. And finally, if you've enjoyed tonight's event and would like to make a donation to support this type of programming, we would be grateful for that. You can do this at our website, brattleboromuseum.org/support. I also encourage you to donate to the Endangered Alphabets Project. And I put the link for that in the chat, but it's endangeredalphabetsproject.com/how-to-support-us. So I think that does it. Scott and Tim, thank you again so much. It was a true pleasure hearing from you both. And with that, stay safe, everyone, and have a good evening. I hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Okay. Good night.
Take care.